aloud. Today, the committee will examine how robots, automation, and technology are transforming our economy. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here, and I'll be introducing the three of you shortly. But first, I'd like to draw the committee's attention to the gavel that I just used to start today's hearing. It looks and functions like a typical gavel, but this gavel, which we normally use, is crafted out of a block of wood and carved down to a machine will carve this down into the form that it is. This one started as a pile of dust, a compound, a plastic compound. And instead of taking a block of wood and carving down the traditional gavel, we have built this, not me, this has been built through 3D printing process. The Washington, D.C. Public Library's Fabrication Laboratory, or what they call the Fab Lab, using 3D printing. An amazing advance in technology, amazing. 3D printing works by heating up raw material, and in this case plastic, in the compound from which plastic is made, one small layer at a time until the object is completed. And rather than needing to mold or carve raw material as we did in the past, we now put our file into a printer, and it creates the item according to the user's specific expectations and specifications. I also have with me a different 3D printed gavel that we will use to adjourn the meeting. I'll have to bang it a little harder. But it was made by students at the Washington Mathematics Science Technology Public Charter High School, located here in the District of Columbia. What an exciting new world we live in, and where objects can be manufactured on demand and with such ease and specificity. I'd like to thank both institutions for their contributions to today's hearings, which tangibly illustrate the topic we're about to explore. I'd also like to thank Senator Lee and his staff for helping the committee prepare for today's hearing. Recent technological developments have been pushing the envelope faster and further than was expected even a decade ago, making what was once thought of as a science fiction a reality. I remember the hassle of getting my children to program our VCR, and now my cable box is capable of recording all my favorite shows without me even asking. And meanwhile, some of my grandchildren are probably saying, "What was a VCR?" The robotic machines are here. Whether it is vacuuming our carpets or assisting in precise surgeries, robots are helping with and performing almost every task that we can imagine. This has led to a greater abundance of consumer products and more productivity and creative workers. However, as with the Industrial Revolution and previous revolutions, this new robotic revolution clearly is contributing to pressures arising within our changing labor force. Even before these technological advances, America's workforce was starting to age, and businesses were beginning to rely much more on automated labor than physical labor. Robots are expected to hasten this trend as they fill in for humans in both blue and white-collar jobs. This picture, which I'm going to put up, I don't know where it is, we were going to put up somewhere, shows a modern assembly line and illustrates the prevalence of automation in today's economy. Where workers used to assemble vehicles directly by hand, now they oversee teams of precise robots that can weld and assemble vehicles far more advanced than ever before. We have a number of assembly plants in Indiana. I've been through each and every one of them over a period of my service dating back to 1981 in the Congress. I'm used to seeing that line filled with dozens of human beings assembling parts to the making of an automobile or a truck, hand by hand. Now all I see is a number of robots doing that same process. Where workers used to assemble directly by hand, they now oversee through teams of precise robots that can weld and assemble vehicles far more advanced than ever before. Automation's rapid progress has also raised challenges with certain government policies. How can we foster an environment where innovators thrive and grow? How can we foster a social safety net prepared for 21st century labor markets? Do some government policies make human workers prohibitively expensive for employers? How will current workers adapt? And is our education system preparing our youngest citizens for the future economy? These are important questions, and for guidance, we look forward to hearing the views of our distinguished witnesses. Today, we will hear from Dr. Andrew McAfee, Principal Research Scientist and co-founder of MIT's Institute Initiative on the Digital Economy. We also welcome Adam Keiper, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, Adam, fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and editor of the quarterly technology publication, The New Atlantis. Our final witness is Harry Holzer, professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University and senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution. My thanks to all of you for providing us with your expertise and giving us a glimpse and the possibilities of the future. I now would like to recognize Ranking Member Maloney for her opening statement.
Thank you so much, Chairman Coates, for really calling such an important and interesting and timely hearing. We are here today to discuss the impact of automation on jobs and the economy and how best to harness the immense power of technological innovation. The United States has long been a leader in this important area, and basic research funded by the federal government has played a key role in driving innovation. We know that automation can boost productivity, lift aggregate demand, reduce consumer prices, and improve our quality of life. While all of these benefits are apparent in the long run, we also know that in the short run, innovation can displace workers, causing severe economic pain to workers whose jobs are automated out of existence or whose wages are reduced dramatically. Today's hearing is about the future, and let's face it, automation is a difficult thing to predict. We don't know what's going to happen, and we just don't know how fast it's going to happen or in which industries or what will be the exact consequences. One study finds that nearly half of U.S. jobs are at risk of being lost to automation in the next couple of decades. Other studies show that the impacts of automation will not be as great or felt so soon. Throughout history, concerns have been voiced that new technologies would make human labor obsolete. It has not happened. While there have been dramatic shifts in how people have earned their livings, the quantity of jobs has increased and the quality has improved. Yet there are reasons to believe that this could be different in the future. I'd like to add some of my questions to the excellent questions Senator Coates put forward. How do we equip our workers with the tools and skills needed to adapt to the future changes? What should we do as policymakers to both advance innovation and the expected productivity benefits on the one hand, while also supporting workers adversely affected by technological changes on the other hand? And how can we harness this engine of prosperity while making sure that benefits are widely shared? I really am excited to learn more and to hear the questions and exchange here today with our excellent witnesses. But before I yield back my time, I'd like to turn to Senator Peters, a former colleague in the House of Representatives. We miss you. And I'd like to yield the balance of my time to him. He is the co-founder of the bipartisan Senate Smart Transportation Caucus. Senator Peters has a deep interest and knowledge of automation and its impacts in Michigan and the rest of the United States, and I yield him the remainder of my time, and it's always good to see you again.
Well, good to see you as well, Ranking Member Maloney, and thank you for yielding your time. You know, as a senator representing Michigan, I'm acutely aware of the incredible opportunities and challenges that automation brings to our economy. Today, the American auto industry is generating connected and automated vehicle technologies and mobility solutions that surpass really all of the innovations in that industry's history. These disruptions will really redefine transportation in the United States and will result in thousands of lives being saved. It will reduce personal insurance costs, will reduce congestion and benefits to the environment. And these advancements are not decades away. In fact, in the model year 2017 Cadillac CTS will leave the factory equipped with vehicle-to-vehicle technology on board, which NHTSA predicts at full penetration could reduce the number of accidents on our roads by nearly 80%. And at a time when nearly 40,000 people die on our highways every year, that is a big deal. As the industry moves towards a world where we have fully autonomous driverless cars that are talking to each other and to infrastructure, we as policymakers have to start thinking about how to eliminate some of the potential barriers to these developments. As Ranking Member Maloney mentioned, I found the Smart Transportation Caucus with my colleague, Senator Cory Gardner, so that we can have these discussions about automotive cybersecurity, the future of liability, and other serious implications for the future. But I'm pleased that here today we're talking about what these new technologies will mean for the American workforce when the livelihoods of so many men and women in this country actually depend on the driving of a vehicle, whether it's a car or a truck. The future of mobility, innovation, and automation presents both great opportunities as well as great challenges, and I look forward to the witnesses. And thank you, Chairman, for holding this very important hearing.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Ranking Member Maloney. And let me now introduce our panel of witnesses. Andrew McAfee is a principal research scientist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, studying how digital technologies are changing business, the economy, and society. In 2014, he co-authored a book entitled The Second Machine Age, Work Progress and Prosperity in Time of Brilliant Technologies. His work has been published in the Harvard Business Review, The Economist, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. He holds a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering, a master's in management, and a doctorate from Harvard Business School. We welcome you, Dr. McAfee. Adam Keiper is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and the editor of the New Atlantis, a quarterly journal about the ethical, political, social, and policy implications of modern science and technology. He's worked on Capitol Hill and various think tanks over his career, and he writes on science and technology policy. And Harry Holzer is a professor of public policy at the McCourt School at Georgetown University. He is currently an Institute Fellow at the American Institutes for Research, a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings, a senior affiliate at the Urban Institute, and a research affiliate of the Institute of Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Prior to coming to Georgetown, Professor Holzer served as chief economist for the U.S. Department of Labor and professor of economics at Michigan State University. He received his BA and PhD in economics from Harvard. Welcome, Dr. Holzer. With that, let me start with our witnesses. Dr. McAfee, you can be first and give us a summary of your remarks, and then we will go down the line and then turn it over to some other members and work through the question process. Dr. McAfee.
Chairman Coates, I'd like to thank you, Vice Chair Tiberi, and Ranking Member Maloney, and the other members of the committee for having me here today. It's a great honor. I want to make 4 points. The first one is that the American workforce is very clearly going through some fairly major changes. And to illustrate that point, I would like to show a graph of the post-war United States economy that has 4 lines on it. 2 of those lines relate to output. They are GDP per capita and productivity over decades of time. And 2 of those lines are about the workforce. They're about raw job creation and then median household income. On average, are we creating good jobs or not? And what you notice with that picture is that for several decades after the end of World War II, those 4 lines were all going up. That's the direction that we want. And they were all going up just about in lockstep. And then more recently, we've noticed what my co-author and I call a great decoupling. The 2 lines related to output have continued to go on a pretty healthy upward trajectory, while the 2 lines related to the workforce have, in a sense, stalled out. And by some measures, the median American householder family is worse off in income terms than they were at the turn of the century. So something is pretty clearly going on. The second point that I'd like to make is that this is a really complicated phenomenon, but one of the forces driving these changes is technological progress. And the way that's been happening so far is that technology has been really good at automating routine work. And by that, I mean both physical work, think of an assembly line in a factory, and knowledge work. The routine knowledge work as a payroll clerk in that same factory. We've had technologies for decades now that have been pretty good at automating that kind of work. And if I could show my next picture, that's my favorite picture of what happens as technology does its work over time. This is a graph of total U.S. manufacturing output, again, over almost the entire post-war history. That's the blue line, and we continue to be a manufacturing powerhouse around the world, and manufacturing output goes up almost every non-recession year. The red line is total U.S. manufacturing employment, and that has been on a fairly steady downward trajectory. So this graph clearly shows that we are doing more and more with fewer and fewer workers over time in this industry. It's a trajectory that we're starting to see in other industries as well. The third point that I'd like to make is, as we're fond of saying in Indiana, we ain't seen nothing yet. And Senator Coates, the gavel that you showed is an illustration of some of these amazing developments in additive manufacturing or 3D printing. When I look around at the technology landscape and I see artificial intelligence systems and deep learning and machine learning that can beat humans at the games that they themselves devised, when I see autonomous cars and trucks, when I see drones that can move in a swarm and accomplish work together with no oversight whatsoever, I see all these forces coming together. And the main thing that I think is going to happen is that these phenomena that we've already seen in the workforce, this hollowing out of the middle class, the pressures that we see on the average American family, who that middle class was built on the back of routine physical and knowledge work. I expect these phenomena to continue and for some of these challenges to accentuate because technological development is not slowing down. I believe it's speeding up, and it's eating into areas where it has not been present before. It used to be the case that if you wanted to listen to a person and respond to what they wanted, you had to have a human being involved in that work. It's just not the case anymore. The final point that I want to make, though, is that this is not the time for alarmism and for planning for an economy that has no more jobs in it. That's just not where we are yet. We are generating on the average of more than 150,000 jobs every month in the country, so we're not yet at the point of peak jobs or peak labor. Instead, I think we need to kind of retool or reconfigure some things that we're doing to meet the challenges of this age that we're heading into, and to keep in mind for myself what the right changes or right policy interventions are. I just keep humming the old McDonald theme song to myself because E-I-E-I-O tells me a great deal about where we need to make some changes. And for me, that means education. It means immigration reform. It means facilitating and encouraging more entrepreneurship. It means doubling down on our infrastructure, which is in fairly unhealthy shape. And then finally, the O for me is original research. It's pretty clear that companies are great at applied research, and they tend to underinvest in the very fundamental developments that eventually yield things like the internet and the iPhone to us. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Keiper.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Maloney, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this important hearing on robotics and automation. In the years ahead, these aspects of technology may profoundly reshape our economic and social lives. A good place to start discussions of this sort is with a few words of gratitude and humility. Gratitude, that is, for the many wonders that automation, robotics, and artificial intelligence have already made possible. They have made existing goods and services cheaper and helped us to create new kinds of goods and services, contributing to our prosperity and our material well-being. And humility, because of how poor is our ability to peer into the future. There is reason to believe that major breakthroughs in automation and robotics are right around the corner, but we should recall that just because we can imagine something does not mean it's actually possible. Even if it's possible, that doesn't mean it will really happen. Even if it really does happen, that doesn't mean it will happen in quite the way we imagined it. And even if it does come to pass in something like the way we imagined, there are likely to be all manner of unintended and unexpected consequences. That said, what do we know, and what do we believe is coming? There are two reasons today's concerns about automation are fundamentally different from what came before. First, the kinds of thinking that our machines are capable of doing are changing so that it is becoming possible to hand off to our machines ever more of our cognitive work. Second, we're also creating new kinds of machines that can navigate and move about in and manipulate the physical world. The recent blizzard of technical breakthroughs in movement, sensing, control, and to a lesser extent power are bringing us for the first time into a world of autonomous, mobile entities that are neither human nor animal. To simplify, maybe oversimplify, a vast technical and economic literature, there are basically three scenarios for what the next several decades hold in automation, robotics, and AI. In the first scenario, automation and artificial intelligence will continue to advance, but at a pace sufficiently slow that society and the economy can gradually absorb the changes. The job market will evolve, but in something like the way it's changed over the last half-century. Some kinds of jobs will disappear, but new kinds of jobs will be created, and in many cases, we'll find new ways for human beings to use and to work alongside machines. In the second scenario, automation, robotics, and artificial intelligence will advance very rapidly. They will take off. In this scenario, there may be great productivity and enormous economic growth, but jobs may disappear at a pace that will make it difficult for the workforce to adapt without pain. Pressures on American workers in mid-skilled jobs will be exacerbated, and there will be new pressures on workers in high-skilled and low-skilled jobs. This scenario could involve severe economic disruption and perhaps social unrest and calls for political reform. In the third scenario, advances in these fields will produce something utterly new, maybe something dangerous. This is more of the sci-fi notion. You've probably heard about the singularity, superintelligence, things like that. These are strange and radical possibilities, and it's difficult to really say much about what they might mean at a human scale. Now, a handful of policy ideas have been proposed that would seek to let us enjoy the fruits of these technological advances while avoiding some of the worst possible effects of disruption. Some of the ideas involve adapting workers to the new economy. We hear that workers must engage in lifelong learning and upskilling, and they must be as flexible as possible. Of course, education and flexibility are very good things. They can make us resilient in the face of what economists call creative destruction. Yet we have to be careful not to place too much of our hope in flexibility, since workers are not just workers. They're also members of families and members of communities. Flexibility can be easier to talk about than to do. Another proposal one often hears discussed is a universal basic income guaranteed to every individual, even if he or she does not work. This idea has both critics and supporters across the political spectrum. It would present a profound transformation of our economic system, but some would argue maybe a necessary one if we see a profound shift in the nature of work. Mr. Chairman, the rise of automation, robotics, and AI raises many questions that extend far beyond the matters of economics and employment we're discussing today. Many legal, practical, regulatory, moral matters, maybe even existential matters. And I mentioned a few of these in my written testimony. I just want to end by saying another word or two about the meaning of work. The science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke said some 4.5 decades ago that we shouldn't worry about people losing their jobs because of automation. We should look forward to it. We should embrace it. The goal of the future should be unemployment. That should be our goal. That notion raises deep questions about who and what we are as human beings and the ways in which we find purpose in our lives. Work is not just a matter of toil, but a source of structure, meaning, friendship, fulfillment. In the years ahead, as we contemplate the blessings and the burdens of these new technologies, my hope is that we will strive whenever possible to exercise human responsibility, to protect human dignity, and to use our creations for the improvement of truly human flourishing. Thank you.
Doctor, you're on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me this afternoon. I'd also like to make 4 points about how technology and automation will affect the labor market and about appropriate policies to deal with that. So my first point is that fears of automation and the view that they will eliminate millions of jobs historically have been vastly overblown. We all know about the Luddites in Britain. Various times in the US, we've had automation scares in the 50s and 60s. This has never so far turned out to be true. There's been no aggregate job loss in the long run associated with new technologies, even though individual workers have often been displaced. But my second point, even if technology hasn't eliminated large numbers of jobs in the aggregate, it can and has reduced earnings among large groups of workers. In the past 35 years, the digital revolution, globalization, and weakening institutions like labor unions together have reduced employment in good-paying job categories, especially for those workers with only a high school education or less. The jobs most affected were goods-producing jobs for men, clerical jobs for women. But at the same time, wages and jobs have increased for workers who either have the technical skills to deal with the new technology, like machinists, technicians, and engineers, or who have other skills that complement the machinery. Those skills can be analytical, or communication skills, or even creative skills. There's a strong skill bias in the technology that actually helps some workers and hurts others. There's likely a capital bias as well, that the owners of the capital embodying the new technology profit at the expense of workers overall. But on the skill bias, Dr. McAfee referred to polarization. We have had growing polarization in the labor market, growing top, growing bottom, shrinkage in the middle. But the middle's not disappearing, and it's not going to disappear anytime soon. There's a new middle growing in sectors like healthcare, IT, advanced manufacturing, parts of the service sector. But those jobs require a lot more education and post-secondary training than many workers in the labor market have. The problem is that polarization is leading to stagnating or even declining real wages right now for less educated Americans, and especially less educated men. And the declining real wages of less educated men tend to, number one, reduce their activity in the labor market. A lot of them have simply left the labor market. And also their participation in institutions like marriage. And I think this hurts the overall economy as well as their families, their children, and their neighborhoods when this occurs. So we want to reverse and halt that wage stagnation. My third point, artificial intelligence and robotics are very hard to predict in terms of future trends. It's possible that the breadth and the pace of labor market dislocations will grow, as my colleagues have indicated. But let's be clear, to date, there is no evidence whatsoever that this has happened yet. Productivity growth in the US has actually been declining in the last 10 years. That's exactly the opposite of what you would predict based on all the stories we've heard. The fluidity and dynamism and churning in the labor market have declined in the United States. Again, the opposite of what you might heard. Now, that could turn around. That could change in 5 and 10 and 20 years. Jobs could become more unstable, and they could become harder to find. We just don't see it yet in the numbers. Which means, number 4, future automation should not be an excuse to avoid or eliminate a sensible, moderate set of worker supports and services to address the labor market problems that we've already seen. And several of those problems now exist. Therefore, we need solutions on several fronts. The most important being the skill bias of technology. There's a range of changes we need to make in our skill-producing institutions, especially community colleges, workforce services, career counseling, growing partnerships between industry and our skill-producing sectors, making community colleges more responsive to the labor market, I think with higher accountability. I'm a supporter of accountability in this sense. Apprenticeships, career technical education, and lifelong learning, all of those need to be on the table for improving skills. I think institutions have to be protected. Not only the rights of workers to collectively bargain, which are under assault in various places, I believe we need to support high-road employers who invest in the skills and high performance and high compensation of their workers. A lot of employers do very well taking the low road, reducing their labor costs at any price. They can do very well in that sense, and that might be what hurts our productivity in the United States. Thirdly, we need, if the labor market becomes more unstable, we do need to make sure that universal benefits are available and portable, health care, paid family leave, et cetera. And then finally, we actually might need to invest in more job creation if the pace of displacement picks up and overwhelms the labor market. So there's lots of issues on the table, lots to discuss, and happy to engage in that conversation afterwards. Thank you.
Dr. Holzer, thank you. I think it's a fascinating topic here with major implications for the future of the country and for, as you said, individuals, workers, families, our society. I'm going to try to combine a couple of thoughts here into one question and turn to the three of you to respond. Dr. Holzer, it pretty much goes along the line of what you were saying, because my question was going to be this. We have, if you look back in history, several game changers of immense proportions, moving from an agricultural society to a manufacturing society, and now we're moving into a new type of is there something different about this phase that we're moving into that separates it from any other? Can we base some conclusions on conventional wisdom in terms and research relative to what has happened over historical. Are we seeing something entirely new that we really cannot totally forecast the direction that it's going? You raised the question, Dr. Holzer, and I'd like to have the others respond to, this sort of a mystery of why isn't productivity, with all this automation, with machines working 24/7, you don't have to pay for health care, they don't go on vacation, they don't go on holidays, tremendous increases in the productivity. Why don't we see that trend in productivity on a much higher trend going up rather than being fairly flat? And participation rate. Are people, is the fact that automation is taking over jobs contributing significantly to our relatively low participation rate? And what impact is that having on participation rate? So if I could start with Dr. McAfee, this is my question, and ask each of the three of you, and then Dr. Holzer, you can then kind of wrap up there. But what are your thoughts of the other two witnesses regarding this?
Chairman Coates, I think you're asking exactly the right questions, and they're extremely difficult questions. To your first one, is this time different? The only honest answer is we don't know. And I agree with Professor Holzer. The historical pattern would lead you to be kind of calm about what's happening, because we faced big disruptions before, and our economy grew, our labor force grew, and the American worker was better and better off. The reason I showed that first picture was to show that there's something that looks fairly different in the data. When we look at job growth, it has tapered off. When we look at average incomes, they have been slowly declining or holding steady for a very long period of time, well before the Great Recession. So there seems to be something new in the data there. And when I look around at the kinds of technological advances that we're seeing, I try not to get too starry-eyed about them, but they do feel like something new under the sun to me. My way of thinking about it is most of our previous technologies could only encroached a very small amount into the total bundle of things that a worker might go try to offer an employer. So we had technologies that could lift more than we could, that could travel across distances faster, and that could do arithmetic better than we could. Okay, we bring a lot more to the table than that. We can deal with ambiguous situations. We can understand human speech. We can recognize very, very subtle patterns. That's all fantastic. I've seen technologies that can do all of those things, do them at a very high level, and I think are either already or very quickly going to achieve superhuman performance in a lot of these areas. To give one example, if a piece of technology is not already the world's best medical diagnostician, I think it will be fairly quickly. So my version, and again, we have to be very humble and cautious about this, my take is that something actually is different. Now, your other excellent question, why hasn't this showed up in the productivity statistics? There's a huge debate about that. I think two things are going on. Number one, a lot of these science fiction advances that I've been talking about are very, very new. They're honestly, most of them within the past 5 years. They just haven't had a chance to diffuse throughout the economy very, very broadly yet. The other thing is, I like to keep in mind an image of two economies. There's kind of an extraordinarily productive, automated, technologically sophisticated one. You know, think of Google and Apple as exemplars of that. And then think of another economy that's very, very labor intensive and only grows by adding more people to the mix. Think of a home health aide as an example of that. Basically, most of the jobs we're adding are in that second low productivity economy, more so than was in the past. When that's the case, we're going to observe very low productivity growth as we're measuring it, even though that first economy is ticking along at a very healthy clip.
Keiper, or anything you'd like to add to that?
I think that was a wonderful answer. I would like to associate myself with most of that answer. I just add a point or two as to why not more productivity over the course of the last decade. I mean, the Great Recession is a major cause, a major explanation that I think most of us would turn to. And just to also amplify what Professor McAfee was saying, it takes time for some of these technological advancements to be picked up and adopted by firms in less high-tech sectors. So you may see over the course of the next years and decades ahead real advances in productivity in firms that are in, forgive me, stodgier fields than you might see in Silicon Valley.
Thank you. And Dr. Holzer, just to wrap up here, give us your thoughts.
Well, I think Dr. McAfee did cover most of the relevant things. I'll just add a few things. So there could be a time lag, as everybody suggests. Robert Solow, the great economist of technical change, famously said at the end of the 1980s, if there's all this technological change going on, why don't we see any of it in the productivity numbers? And of course, in the 90s, you did see it briefly. A second possibility, though, is that the nature of the changes will not be as dramatic as some of those we've seen to date. And the biggest proponent of this view is Robert Gordon at Northwestern, who's written a very challenging book, recently saying this stuff doesn't compare at all to the changes in the late 19th century, early 20th century, electricity, the internal combustion engine, indoor plumbing that dramatically changed American businesses and American homes. So he's sort of a techno-pessimist, just doesn't think that these technologies will be as groundbreaking. But it also could be, as Dr. McAfee said, that a lot of the growth right now are for services that right now can only be done by humans. A lot of the elder care, child care kinds of work, it's not necessarily very high skilled, but robots can't do that and won't be able to do that. The human touch will not be there for a long time. So it could be a mix of these things. We won't know for a while. But I do want you ask, what about the declining labor force participation? And is it directly that the machines are displacing workers and kicking them out of the workforce? I don't think that's it. I think there's an intermediate step having to do with wages. All the forces that have reduced the wages of less educated workers, technology, globalization, weakening institutions, as those wages have stagnated and declined, a lot of workers simply don't believe it's in their interest, it's worth their while to stay in the labor force, and I think that's why they leave. And that's why dealing with stagnant wages through or separately from the technology, I think, is our prime concern right now.
Thank you. Thank you, witnesses, for those answers. Vice Chair Maloney.
Thank you so much. Dr. McAfee, you wrote in a recent piece in the Financial Times that the skills many people have are becoming less valuable in the labor market because of globalization and also technological advances. You wrote, and I'm quoting here, quote, "We need to figure out how to deal with this situation. This will be one of the most important policy arenas over the coming decades," end quote. And on page 6 of your written testimony today, you note that Econ 101 playbook is very clear on what has to be done, but that it's not being followed. Could you clarify what you mean by that, and what could we be doing in a better way in the policy arena to both boost productivity and ensure that more people can benefit from these new technologies? And I'd like to hear Dr. Holzer and Mr. Keiper's take on this question too, but thank you.
Yes, thank you. Let me try to address the education question first and then broaden out to the whole Econ 101 playbook. As one of my colleagues says, the way we're educating people right now, in other words, I believe it's still dominated by rote learning, by the memorization of large amounts of facts and the ability to regurgitate them, and the ability to do fairly basic math and arithmetic, for example. I have a colleague who says those are exactly the skills that you need if you're on top of a mountain with no internet access. Or they're exactly what we needed workers to do 50 years ago. That's just not what we need anymore. And if it is true that technology has been eating into that routine work, we need to be teaching our students and our workers to be good at the less routine stuff. What's in that category? I would say creativity, I would say different flavors of social skills such as negotiation, motivation, persuasion, coordination. There's research that shows how valuable these skills still are. I didn't learn a lot of those in school. And then finally, just the ability to recognize a problem and to go after that problem, which is a combination, I believe, of creativity and grit. We're learning a bit, I believe, about how to teach those in schools. Our educational system at the primary level is still dominated by rote learning and fairly basic quantitative skills, and I think that needs to change. I hope it happens quite quickly. Your broader question that I heard about the Econ 101 playbook, for example, our infrastructure gets a grade of D+ from the Society of Civil Engineers in America. I just don't see any reason why that needs to be the case. The entrepreneurship in America, as Professor Holzer says, is on a steady decline. Most measures of business dynamism are actually heading in the wrong direction for the past decade or so. Figuring out why that is and reversing it, I think, is critically important. When I think about the fact that a shampooer in Tennessee needs 70 days of training before they can start their job, it makes my head spin. So there does appear to be a thicket of regulations and other barriers that are getting in the way of entrepreneurship and job creation and dynamism. So dealing with that seems very important to me too. And then finally, when you go look around Silicon Valley and the other centers of great dynamism, I'm just unbelievably impressed by the number of foreign-born founders and workers and extraordinary contributors out there. So liberalizing our immigration policies and getting those people who want to build their lives and careers into America seems to me an incredibly straightforward thing to do. I don't know an economist who disagrees, and yet I find our immigration policies kind of Kafkaesque.
Dr. Holzer, I'd like to bring you into this, and what are your comments on it?
We all agree that there's a skills problem in America, and skills exist on
Doctor,
many,
push your button there.
there's many different kinds of skills, different dimensions of skills. Dr. McAfee talked about important general skills, reasoning ability, communicative skills, et cetera. Those are clearly very important. There are more specific technical skills that matter as well, that many of our industries, like advanced manufacturing, are having trouble finding people to do that kind of work. So we have skills gaps on different dimensions. A big problem is our K-12 system. Our K-12 system doesn't prepare a lot of workers for the kinds of technical training that often needs to happen at community colleges, so that's an issue. But the whole institution of community college, to me, is a funny hybrid. Historically, it was a liberal arts institution, a stepping stone to the four-year schools. And a lot of the people there still think that way. Most of the instructors there want to teach anthropology, not machine tooling, or not phlebotomy, and that's an issue. But the institution itself doesn't respond very well to labor market forces. Institutions get the same public subsidy no matter what their outcomes are, so their incentives to really emphasize on career development, career building skills, I think, are limited. And in general, you know, the training for a lot of the jobs that are hard to fill is actually pretty expensive. Putting equipment on college campuses is really expensive. The instructors in many of these areas, everything from nursing to machining, are also expensive. So a lot of the forces are not aligned well for that intermediate institution like community colleges, I think, to play the kinds of role it can. We all talk a lot about apprenticeships and work-based learning. There's other issues there about why small and medium-sized employers either don't have the knowledge about that or the resources to do that effectively. So I think on a lot of different dimensions, we could do a lot better, but it's going to take a lot of work and it's going to take some resources as well.
Okay. Mr. Keiper, I loved your quote at the end of your testimony this morning. I'd like to get a feel of how extensive are robots in our world. I know that in medical technology, they're using robots quite a bit, and certainly Senator Peters mentioned in the building of cars. But what percentage of, how much of it is in America? And I welcome anyone to comment on it. I went to China several years ago, and I wanted to see their solar plants, where I expected to see a lot of people running around and working very hard. And what I saw were a bunch of robots walking around with humans managing them on a computer. You could have blown me away. I didn't know that type of work was there. So what is the sense of the world? Where do we stand? Are we even with the world going forward with robots, or others producing more robots than we are? Where do we stand in the globalization of it? How big is it? Is it helping? And then, of course, how do we protect our workers in it?
All wonderful questions, and some of them very complicated. I guess it's difficult in some ways to know how many robots there are because different people define them different ways. If the word robot had been around 100 years ago, it hadn't yet been coined, we probably would talk about early household appliances like the dishwasher as a robot. But because it predated the coining of the word, we didn't apply it that way. And, I think there may be a period when we'll talk about robotic cars, these driverless vehicles, and then after a while, we'll just start calling them cars. So it depends partly on terminology. But to answer what I take you to really be getting at, they are being adopted in developed countries around the world, chiefly in the manufacturing sector. The United States is, by most measures, leading the world in this area. Although other developed nations are doing very well. Germany, China, in some respects, depends on how you measure in raw numbers of robots or per capita. I just want to say two small additional points, just to piggyback on things that each of the other panelists mentioned. First, something Professor Holzer mentioned about the era of incredible invention that we saw from the mid-19th century through the early decades of this century, when we saw electrification and lighting and audio recording and all these amazing things. And by some comparisons, they got the low-hanging fruit, and some scholars would say, look, it's harder to see where the next steps are. It reminds me of the famous line from venture capitalist Peter Thiel. He says, I was promised flying cars, and all I got is these 140 characters, a reference to Twitter. The point, I think, really is that, and it's a point Thiel himself has made, that we need to encourage creativity and looking for major kinds of innovations. It's wonderful that we're talking about driverless cars. I wonder if we couldn't think about greater kinds of innovations and get back some of the optimism that we had in the middle of the 20th century that in some ways seems to have waned. And then finally, Professor McAfee mentioned the possibility of teaching, educators teaching creativity and grit. Can you really teach creativity and grit? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. I think teachers can certainly harm creativity and can harm grit, and we have to, at the very least, do our best to prevent that from happening. Last thing I'll say, I read recently a biography of Gordon Moore. He's the man who gave us Moore's Law, co-founder and president of Intel. And, brilliant, creative man. And he he chalks up some of his success to his kind of wild outdoors childhood and his early love of chemistry, where he was free to just go around in his backyard and blow stuff up. I mean, he just blew stuff up for fun. You can't really do that today. We live in a different kind of world, a different society, and a kid who's just blowing stuff up for fun is more likely to get in some serious legal trouble than to grow up to become one of the wealthiest and most important innovators of a century. So it's not just a matter of instilling in children creativity and grit. It's a matter of thinking about, as parents, as communities, how to not kill those things off when they arise naturally.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Vice Chair Thieberry.
Thanks, Chairman Coates, and thanks for holding this fascinating hearing today. Great testimony from all three of you.
Great.
Dr. McAfee, I was quite interested in your written testimony when you comment about trade. In my home state of Ohio, opponents of trade use or say every single job that's been lost is because of trade, not because of technology or automation or things that you talk about in your testimony. You mentioned in your written testimony that mid-wage, mid-skill jobs like factory jobs, and my dad was a factory worker, are not being created as the same rate in the past because of globalization and technological progress, which I've seen in Ohio. Other thing I've heard as well is overregulation. Earlier this year, a CEO of a service company told me that because of what he believed was overregulation by the Obama administration, that some, across industries, by the way, were going to use technology sooner than they otherwise would. Gave me an example in the restaurant industry. My first job was McDonald's, that the job that I had in the future in America in the restaurant industry probably would not be there for a 16-year-old, because technology was going to take that job. And inside of the fact that the overregulation of employment in France, and he'd been to France, where now you order in many restaurants, not with a person, but with a tablet, and the first person you see is when you pick up your food. And then I heard that a major restaurant chain in the United States, just last month, citing overregulation, was actually testing this pilot out in the United States. So it's that as well. So we're not going backward with respect to globalization or technology. The world continues to move ahead, whether we do or not, whether it's on trade, whether it's on technology. And as you wrote in your testimony, it's provided unbelievable benefits to society and to our country and to our citizens. Yet, as you say, people aren't feeling it. They aren't believing it. Even though they might pay lower prices and might have better products, they're not associating those benefits with what you talk about in your testimony. And your testimony highlighted several ways that government can lessen the negative impact of these challenges and side effects. And I was particularly struck by your point about the importance of encouraging entrepreneurship. It helps ensure that we have a vibrant economic system, an ecosystem that's constantly regenerating itself. I've seen it in my Central Ohio district, creating employment opportunities for more workers. I'm the first of my family to graduate from high school. So I don't know if you've seen this information that was just released earlier this week by the Bipartisan Economic Innovation Group. They highlighted some pretty interesting economic trends. The research they released said that new business formation between 2010 and 2014, which the Obama administration called the time of national economic recovery, that we suffered an unprecedented collapse compared to previous recoveries in our history. And that furthermore, new business formation was far more geographically concentrated than in past recoveries in our history. And to put it in perspective, this is an unbelievable statistic. 20 counties in the United States, 20 alone, produced half of all net new businesses in the U.S. economy between 2010 and 2014. So these findings, I believe, underscore why it's important to support legislation that Congressman Ron Kind and I worked on together, and that's Investing in Opportunity Act to increase access to capital in distressed communities and in new enterprises and startups. Your testimony highlighted another solution, which is the need to decrease the overregulation of new innovation. Can you kind of expand on that and elaborate on the policy and regulatory issues that are most concern to you in relation to entrepreneurship and stifling entrepreneurship?
Yeah, Vice Chair Tiberi, thank you for that excellent question, because it is an area of increasing concern to me as I look around. A couple things. I've already mentioned the fact that there appears to be this increasingly dense thicket of things that an employer or a worker has to confront before they can start something up. And navigating your way through that becomes increasingly difficult, and it looks like more and more people are saying, I'm just not going to bother with it. One of my favorite phrases coming out of Silicon Valley these days is permissionless innovation. And by that, they mean, let me go do something out there in the world. If it is causing harm, if there are negative consequences, we understand that and we'll deal with that, but please don't make me submit my innovation to any kind of oversight committee or bureaucracy, which will then tell me if I can proceed or not. So I love that phrase, and I've become a big fan of this notion of permissionless innovation. You mentioned the really terrible employment situation in France and some other European countries. It strikes me in my discussions there that they do have a less enthusiastic view of permissionless innovation, and there seems to be a greater idea that the state needs to have a role in approving or channeling the course of innovation. And I certainly don't think that we just need to let innovators go willy-nilly and never ever get in their way and let them drive their driverless cars wherever they want to, as soon as they want to. That would not be prudent. But in general, I do think the thicket is dense and getting thicker, and I do worry about attempts or ideas that I hear that take us away from that idea of permissionless innovation.
Thank you. Our next Senator Klobuchar, had I known what I now know, I would have had a robot come in here with a cake in its hand to present to you with candles, light those candles, and we would all sing happy birthday.
Oh, that would have been nice. Thank you. But it's more the sentiment that counts, I think. You know. But thank you very much. And I want to thank you to the witnesses for this important hearing. I'm really focused on the apprenticeships and preparing our workers for this new economy, coming from a state that already has a 3.7, 3.8% unemployment rate. We just don't have workers to fill some of the technological jobs of all the manufacturing and high-tech work we're doing. And we're going to start losing some businesses in rural Minnesota simply because we don't have the workers. So that plus what you've all been talking about with this permissionless, I just like that. It sounds kind of exotic for the Joint Economic Committee. But with the innovation creates this demand. And I wondered, I guess I would ask you, Dr. Holzer, about I'm just obsessed with this. Apprenticeships doing more. Our country made a MOU with Switzerland, and what Switzerland and Germany are doing to get more students into that technological field. We have a new high school in one of our towns that is amazing, has tracks you can pick from. One of them is manufacturing. All the equipment's on the first floor. We've got companies that are coming into the schools. We've got community colleges that are partnering because the high schools can't get the machinery, but the community colleges maybe can. Just how do you think this should all work, and what could the federal government's role be when we only do about 10% education? I figure it's incentives and things like that, but why don't you address this?
Well, thank you for the question. If you don't mind, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to say what we should not do. What we should not do is get rid of all regulation. I was troubled by the tone of the last question, and
Yes.
this implication that regulation is always bad and always very costly simply is not true. It's not true in theory, and it's not true in fact. Minimum wage laws, EEO laws, occupational safety and health, pension protection. There's a lot of market failures out there. There's a lot of inequities. If you do regulation badly, if you overdo it, if we had a $15 or $20 minimum wage in this country, I would agree. At the range in which minimum wages now are talked about, or possibly increases much more modest, won't have that effect. So I just thought we needed some balance.
I appreciate
but now,
that. I could tell you were getting worked up.
I was having a little trouble.
Now let's get worked up about my thing.
Let's move on to your question about apprenticeship. I mean, there's lots of wonderful examples of things happening out there. In many ways, it's hard to scale them. A lot of what we're doing to expand apprenticeship in America, it's often a very retail operation, employer by employer.
Right, community
providing
back
incentives, and I'm not sure there's any other way to do that, given the
Well,
cost.
Arnie Duncan, I mean, they did some grants that were effective in our sort of exurban areas where they would have them give them an incentive to pair up with.
There are, and we're seeing an expansion of sector partnerships with community colleges, and I like the model I like is where you have apprenticeships with employers, where at the same time the worker gets a certificate or an associate's degree, so they get the general skill credential as well as the specific skills. But it's simply hard to scale. There are biases in the system. As I said, there's institutional problems. The incentives aren't always aligned. And as I said earlier, if people get to the 11th, 12th grade and they're still reading at the 8th or 9th grade level, or they can't have, that's an inhibitor as well. So I think.
And the other thing is, having been the prosecutor and done all these truancy work, you've got kids dropping out that maybe if you did something while they were in high school, where they were working somewhere, getting a one-year degree, two-year degree, depending on what it was, that would be another
I agree.
Because you have a whole workforce you're losing, and they can then go on to get more years of
That's
school.
right. And I really believe that in middle school, American students need a lot more exposure to the workforce, because then they really see this really boring algebra class actually could be very useful for you in a whole range of well-paying jobs, and then you're more motivated to do it. And high-quality CTE in the high schools, models like P-TECH and linked learning and career academies, all of those, there's a pretty solid evidence base on at least some of them. They're all very promising models. The question is always, how do we scale
You're
up
right.
and replicate those good
No.
models? And also because the German companies are flocking to America, the manufacturing companies. They're astounded at what they see, but they know they can't implement their model. It's got to be an American model, fit American institutions, and that's the step-by-step
And also
process.
more women. We were just talking about Mary Barr, the CEO of General Motors, who was an engineer, worked her way up through the company, and is speaking out on this idea that we need more women, more people of color, because we don't have enough people going into these areas. And for women especially, the factory floor is no longer dark, dirty, and dangerous, as you've pointed out by how high-tech it is. So I think that is a piece of this as well. Mr. Keiper, did you want to respond at all?
Only one additional point. I mean, this idea of apprenticeship as it catches on, I think it's wonderful. I'd love to see real experimentation in that area across the states, different kinds of models being adopted and tested. One area that the Obama administration has said a little bit about, but I think a lot more could be said about, is encouraging our young people to take an interest in the trades. For really what feels like decades in some ways.
And their parents aren't always encouraging it because
Right,
of what they've
exactly.
experienced.
Right. I mean, we have encouraged our young people more and more to go into office jobs and desk data management, moving paper around, moving pixels around. And I can't help but wonder whether some people, including some of the people who are electing to get out of the workforce, some of the lower educated men that Professor Holzer was mentioning who are having trouble finding work, whether they might not find other sources of satisfaction if they had been encouraged to look into plumbing and being electricians and roofing and carpentry.
And whether they can trade into it now. And if we
That's
have
right,
such a
exactly.
need that it becomes worth having companies finance those.
That's right.
Some of that
We
degrees.
tend to understate, when we nudge our children in those directions, we tend to understate the real value of being your own boss or working in the trades, and we tend also to forget that, of all the jobs that are going to be automated or going to be replaced with artificial intelligence, you're not going to have a robot doing your roof anytime soon. You're not going to have a robot electrician in your house. The trades, at least for the foreseeable next several decades, are going to require the kind of unique problem solving that human beings can bring to bear.
Nice way of putting it. Thank you so much to all of you.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. It was Bob Dylan's birthday yesterday, too. He's from Minnesota, so thought I'd add that in for some glamour. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Lee was instrumental in asking for this hearing to be held. I think it's a fascinating subject, and we thank you, Senator Lee, and your staff for helping us pull all this together. So you're on. We'll give you a little lenience with time here, just for your support.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd also like to wish Senator Klobuchar a very happy birthday. And yes, and later on I'll be singing happy birthday while doing my interpretive dance to it before I'm replaced with a robot. Dr. McAfee, I'd like to start with you. Utah has a program that allows elementary schools to partner with certain leaders in the high-tech industry to teach 4th, 5th, and 6th graders basic coding skills over a 16-week period. That this program exists is exciting. The fact that it's exciting and the fact that it's somewhat unique and rare ought to be concerning to us. Our schools teach people well, but they generally follow what some might call a 20th century model to educate people and prepare them for what has become a somewhat unique 21st century workplace. So these educators in Utah are doing great work, innovative work, by helping prepare students for the unique employment skills that they will need in the future. My question, though, is about what happens next. I think it's possible that what we think of as high-skilled jobs today could easily become tomorrow's low-skilled jobs, such that in much the same way that the high-skilled welders of yesterday, many of whom have now been replaced, at least on assembly lines for automobiles and many other manufactured products. Many of them are now without jobs. So software developers today could find that in many instances, their jobs have been replaced through automation. What do you think happens when that occurs? And when we develop technology that does our coding for us?
Yep, Senator Lee, it's a great question, and I like your insight that some of the jobs that we consider very safe and very prestigious today might actually flip around because of technological progress. I think Mr. Keiper got it exactly right. We are not going to automate the work of an electrician or a plumber or a prime contractor anytime soon. That's still a human job. However, when I look around, I see technology able to do a lot of the work that a medical diagnostician does, that many kinds of lawyers do, that financial advisors do. I recently turned a lot of my assets over to what they call a robo-advisor, which generates a mathematically optimal portfolio for you and manages it over time with no human intervention whatsoever.
What kind of a commission does the robot charge?
Less than a human does, I'll tell you that. It's one of the reasons that I did it. So I think there could be this interesting inversion for some professions that we consider, again, very prestigious, very safe right now. They're going to see a lot of automation, not in the science fiction future, but in the next 5 to 10 years. Not all of them, however. You mentioned coding, and I think teaching little kids to code is great for two reasons. One is that that job appears to be relatively safe. We have had really lousy luck getting computers to code themselves. Writing good code appears to be closer to writing a novel, and all the attempts at automatic fiction that I've seen are just laughably bad. So we do need a lot of digital professionals to keep making these technologies for us. More fundamentally, though, I think the reason it's great to teach little kids to code is because it teaches them a style of very clear, very difficult thinking that will serve them very well no matter what they wind up doing with their lives. One of the efforts that I love in that area is the first robotics competition, which is spread like wildfire throughout the country, where teams of kids, teams working together, build an actual robot that competes against other teams' robot. It was started by a guy named Dean Kamen, who I think is the closest thing that we have to an Edison in America these days, who just looked around at this kind of stultifying educational system and thought it was inappropriate for a bunch of reasons. So he has grade school and high school kids build robots and go at it with each other, and it's been a runaway success.
That sounds exciting. It sounds like a good reality TV program, especially if you could end up doing like hand-to-hand combat among robots.
That happens, yes.
Mr. Keiper, you talk in your testimony about the nature of the work and the value of work, both to individuals and to society as a whole. What do you think the innate human desire to create value and to be valued in society and by society, what do you think is to come of that, and how do you think that will be affected by these changes in technology? And in particular, as more jobs become automated, do you think for some of the reasons I just mentioned that it would be somewhat hazardous to adopt policies that would involve subsidizing non-work? What would that do to that desire to create value and to lead to new and different jobs?
Well, that's a wonderful and very complicated set of questions. Let me deal with the last part first. We have learned over the course of the last 70 years or so to be very sensitive to incentives and disincentives to work. We saw in the major battles over welfare reform in the 1990s, huge disputes about how law might incentivize or disincentivize work. And as some people have begun to talk about universal income, guaranteed basic income as a potential policy solution to a future in which nobody has to work in some distant future because productivity is so high, all of our basic needs are taken care of, and fewer and fewer people need jobs. That's a really complicated idea. Economists have been fighting about this proposal for decades because if you want to create such a thing, you want to structure it in such a way that you're not disincentivizing work. Some of the most interesting and creative approaches to the guaranteed income policy are approaches that structure it in such a way that they encourage good behavior, including involvement in the economy. So I think it's very likely that we'll hear people from both the left and the right really start to discuss and analyze and debate guaranteed income in the years ahead. As that happens, it's going to be important to really attend to that sensitive question that you're pointing out, the question of making sure we're not disincentivizing work, because, as you say, work is, it's not just a matter of doing something that you dislike for which you are compensated. At its worst, that's what it can, well, at its worst, it can be even worse than that. But at its minimum, it's that. But it can also be a source of pride and dignity, self-definition, and meaning and purpose in human life. And that's sometimes it sounds a little idealistic, I know, but it's really true when you talk to people and we kind of stop looking just at the economic numbers, but listen to the anecdotes, the anecdata as well.
Thank you. I see my time's expired. I'll save my rest of my questions for the second round. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Congressman Schweikert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I throw a hypothesis and pitch something at you because I've not heard it actually discussed? I have some articles and data sitting here in front of me basically talking about that the entire world has a dwindling workforce. If you actually look at the demographic curve of the entire world, that prime productive age groups is actually on a very steep decline worldwide. I have other things here basically saying if you add in energy cost, China now is a more expensive place to manufacture than Indonesia, Thailand, Mexico, India. I'm looking at many of the charts that actually look at productivity per hour, and many of those countries that we fret about repeatedly here in discussion, actually their labor productive cost per hour are exploding. Isn't the movement towards automation our way to deal with, first, our domestic crisis here of a decade of, and it's somewhat, if you actually dig into the data, it's actually it's substantially demographically driven, of falling productivity or flat productivity, that if we're going to demand higher wages for our citizens, it's going to come with a marriage of talent, labor, and automation. And the fact of the matter is the rest of the world is starting to have a shortage of that productive capacity. Tell me where I'm wrong. Anyone?
I'd just jump in first to say I don't think you are wrong, but two additional points. One, the causal arrows go both ways, which is to say the rise in automation and the increasing complexity of certain kinds of jobs requiring more and more years of education have something to do, according to demographers and economists, with the changing structure of demographics.
But much of that demographic curve is just pure population. I mean, pure age population.
Sure, but age and population, I mean, are the result of people marrying at certain times, having different numbers of children.
Yeah. Higher income birth rates fall.
Right, and all, exactly. And those sorts of things are related in complicated ways to the changing nature of work. So that's just a small amplification to what you were saying, not a point of criticism and a point of agreement, if anything. And then I would just add, to kind of further amplify what you're saying, as the demographics change, you look at societies that are aging rapidly. Ours is aging not as rapidly as some countries in Europe, or we're not entirely sure what China's going to look like, but the one-child policy has had a profound effect on that country's demography.
I'll make your argument. We may have a very good idea what.
Well, in some ways, we really might, and it's not pretty. And you're going to hear increasingly And if I'm not mistaken, I think Professor McAfee has written a bit about this here and there. You're going to hear increasingly people talking about the need to use different kind of automation, different kinds of robotics to really work in the growing elder care industry and in other areas.
We're a little off from where I'm wanting to go, and sure. I think Dr. McAfee has actually written on a version of this. My two I want to pitch conceptually is I have a productivity problem in this country. How do I use the demographics I'm blessed with, which is I'm aging, but I'm aging a lot slower than those I compete with, find a way to adopt technology, and that technology also may allow my workforce to work longer. And I know sometimes that that's a whole nother side obligation, but if I'm 70 and wish to continue to be in a productive capacity, does technology allow me to maintain my skill sets? And does that help me find a way to continue a productivity curve while the demographic strain on many of those countries that have competed with us for such a long time? I actually think there's optimism if I direct this the right way with the proper incentives. I mean, Dr. McAfee, right or wrong?
Right, Representative Schweikert. I am personally not worried about the productivity stall-out that we're experiencing now, because when I take the innovations that I've looked around and seen for the past couple of years and project them forward 5 or 10 years, our service industry workers today who are not very productive, doing things like healthcare, I believe they're going to become much more productive. Okay. You mentioned this kind of slow-ticking demographic time bomb that many countries are confronting. We're confronting a less severe version of it. The reason I think that should worry us is not because we won't have enough people to turn out the goods and services that our economies need. I don't think that's the case at all. It's because our current workers pay for our current retirees. The social welfare system is configured that way. As these populations gray, I believe that's going to put a lot of strain on these different countries.
Look, I have a fixation on it because I thought it was very well written. In December, Wall Street Journal did that 2050 series, and some wonderful graphics, some brilliant demography in it. And look, they make your point is in 13 and a half years, Social Security's out of money. In 8.5 years, Medicare's out of money. And so the underlying theme of these sorts of discussions is, okay, if you really care about maintaining of these social contracts, how do we dramatically increase productivity so we have that thing called, money. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and this has been a fascinating hearing, and I've got a number of questions, but I thought I'll start with something that I mentioned in the opening comments, which is something I've been very involved in, being from Michigan, and what's happening in the auto industry and the new transformative technologies that are coming online. In fact, folks are saying the new autonomous features will be more disruptive than or at least equal to when the car first came off the assembly line. That's what we're talking about. But I would kind of like to get each of your perspective on autonomous vehicles, what's happening in mobility, as you are looking at the greater context of what automation is going to do to jobs. You know, this is certainly a central piece that all of you have mentioned in your testimony or in your writings. Give me your assessment of that. What, as policymakers, what should we be thinking about as we're thinking about autonomous vehicles specifically? Dr. McAfee.
Yep. Senator Peters, thank you. I called in all of my favors in 2012 and got a ride in one of Google's autonomous cars. And at the time, I felt like an astronaut. I felt like I was having an experience that very few other people ever had or would get to have going forward. 4 years later, I went for a test drive in a Tesla just a month or so ago, and it has a completely autonomous highway driving feature on it. So in 4 years, that technology went from kind of astronaut level rare to anyone can walk off the street and experience this. I think that's a great example of how quickly technology is progressing these days. And to your specific question, I think that completely autonomous vehicles are, if they're not feasible today, they will be very, very quickly on American roads in traffic, maybe not rush hour Manhattan, but certainly across our interstates. The main implication of that, I guess there are two. One is that fewer lives will be lost, safety will go up, the goods that we ship across the country will get a lot cheaper. It will be a great boon for the country in a lot of ways. The challenge is, I believe in a majority of U.S. states today, the single most common job is truck driver, and I don't think that will be the case even a decade from now. So again, preparing for that and dealing with that aspect of this hollowing out, I think is going to become an increasingly urgent policy arena for us. But my prescription is never to try to turn off the autonomous car. It delivers great benefits to us. And I think American auto manufacturers want to be in the lead on that technology.
Absolutely, absolutely. Dr. Holzer?
So I agree with Dr. McAfee that the losers in this will be motor vehicle operators, truck drivers, bus drivers, et cetera. And that has been an important occupational niche for relatively unskilled workers in America.
One of the largest, in fact, isn't it?
Pardon me?
One of the largest occupational
That's right,
groups.
that's right.
Anyway.
So that could be a big change. Now, it depends, the diffusion of this new technology into use by lots of businesses, I'm not sure of the speed of that transition. It may be very quick, and there may be all kinds of things where the judgment of a driver is still required. So when I think of UPS, and the skills of a UPS driver have actually gotten pretty high in terms of being able to do all kinds of GPS, figuring out the location of their customers, the tracking of the products. I don't know that driverless autonomous vehicles are going to eliminate all those needs for that kind of work. I can see that in some sectors of transportation it might be very rapid, in other sectors more slowly. But let's suppose it's rapid. And let's suppose we do start having this problem of displaced truck drivers, bus drivers, et cetera. What do we do with them? We haven't talked much about that. There's sort of two approaches. One is to try to teach them a new skill. That's when people talk when they mean lifelong learning, sending people back. It's a little easier if you're talking about a welder, which is one of the examples before, right? Old-fashioned welding versus new precision welding. You have a strong base, and you just need a little bit of tweaking. Our success with retraining and re-educating is going to depend a lot on, number one, on the age of that bus driver or truck driver, and number two, on their underlying skill set, right? So it's easier to send a 30-year-old back to community college than a 50-year-old. It's easier to send somebody back who actually is pretty good at reading manuals and handling technical material than someone who's not. So it's going to depend on that. For people, there's going to be a lot of people for whom it simply doesn't make sense to retool and retrain. And for those, I frankly think the best thing we can offer them is some kind of wage insurance. And the whole idea of wage insurance. And wage insurance does incentivize people to work, not to stay on unemployment insurance. It incentivizes people to shift to a lower wage job, but then the government, the federal government, makes up part of the loss. So if you have to downshift from a $20 an hour job to a $10 an hour job, the government might pay half of that difference for 2 or 3 years. Of course, we'd have to fund that, and that would require some additional resources. But that's another way of protecting. Some folks simply can't be retooled and sent back, but others can. And I think we need to be doing some of both to prepare for that kind of world.
Thank you. Mr. Keiper?
Just a quick follow-on to what both of the other panelists have mentioned. If you want to encourage and want to take advantage of the many benefits of driverless vehicles, I would urge you to encourage the legal and insurance industries to start really, to really continue the work that they've already begun in sorting out questions of liability and damages, which in some ways may present greater hurdles than the technical problems, many of which are already solved.
Well, my time's about advised, but you're absolutely right about that, that sometimes policy is a lot slower than technology, and the technology is moving very, very rapidly. And I would add that in addition to some of the insurance issues, also cybersecurity is a big deal, given the fact that it's bad enough when someone steals the money out of your bank account. It's worse if they drive you into a wall. So those are two other things that we have to do here as policymakers. Thank you to all of you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, fascinating questions. No one has yet raised pilotless planes. I'm not sure how many of us would want to board that plane right now. On the other hand, driverless 18-wheelers, gives you pause about what's coming down the road at you. So, and there's going to have to be some education with the public here and demonstrations, I think. But I assume it's just as easy to put people from location to location on a pilotless plane as it is in a car. Something to ponder as you lie in bed at night thinking about the future. Congressman Beyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to begin by piling on with Mr. Keiper's comments earlier about changing the education system. The senator and chairman served in Germany and saw it firsthand, and I did in Switzerland, where they were taking kids at 13 to 14. Switzerland, literally 2/3 of the work of the children's force, and channeling them into plumbing and roofing and auto mechanics, but also nursing and radiology and pharmacy assistants. And so last I checked, the unemployment rate was 1.8%. And year after year, they don't turn out enough kids at 19 for the jobs that exist. So it's tougher when they have to be 50 years old and they're a coal miner, but we have to try anyway. Mr. Keiper, you wrote about universal basic income and a negative income tax. You know, what do you do when actually a significant part of the population doesn't need to be employed? And you wrote also, you said that it's been discussed favorably for various reasons by prominent conservative and libertarian thinkers. Can you expand on why they would be for that? I understand the left-leaning progressives. But.
Sure. Before I get to that, let me just say, yes, I've gone to, visited Germany, Switzerland, studied their education system, taken an interest in it, and while I don't think it would be perfectly applicable here, there may be some states that might want to experiment with adapting American education in something like that direction. As far as the guaranteed basic income, look, this is something that Hayek talked about, something that Milton Friedman spoke about favorably, something that I think Charles Murray has written and spoken about favorably, if I'm not mistaken. I defer to my economist colleagues here to say more about that, but my sense is that folks on the conservative and the libertarian side of the spectrum see it as a couple things. One, it's a way to continue to encourage innovation, and two, it would be I think this is Friedman's approach. It would be less complicated than continuing the bureaucratic system of welfare that we had in place when he was writing about it. He was worried about all of the costs and pressures caused by this complicated system of welfare that we had in place. He thought maybe if you replaced it with something that was simple and clean and seamless, that would be an improvement. There's much more to it than that. There's all kinds of economic modeling that my colleagues here could say much more about, I'm sure. But it's interesting and surprising how you get people on the left and the right talking about this with interest, very little interest in the kind of moderate middle, although I think that's likely to change in the years ahead.
Dr. Holzer.
So I'm going to speak as someone from the moderate left-center position, I understand that this could be necessary down the road. I'm not anxious to go there anytime soon for a couple different reasons. Number one, we have a tax revenue problem in this country, just funding the liabilities we have in Social Security and Medicare. And we have politically an issue that gets demagogued about. We have a massive resistance to almost any kind of tax increase. So this would require, after we've already paid for Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, this would be a massive expenditure of tax revenue on top of that. And it's hard for me to see the American public anytime in the near future going there.
If I can interrupt you for a second, I only have a minute and a half left, and I have a very specific thing for you. Most of the new economy jobs have not lent themselves to unionization. How should the labor movement adapt to this new economy? That's down at...
Not very well, necessarily.
Moving forward, I struggle with the Labor Day speeches. What do I say?
With good reason. Some people think that the model of unionism that we have in America was developed mid-20th century. It was very well suited to that kind of economy, and it's less well suited to an economy with a lot of dynamics and a lot of fluidity in and out of jobs and dramatic new competition. So if you look at the SEIU as one industry, they have found niches. They've been successful unionizing hotel workers in places like Las Vegas and LA that we might not have anticipated. But also they take on more political roles, right? So they work hard for candidates and for policies like a higher minimum wage. And maybe that's, I think we're struggling for a new institutional model that fits the new reality of the 21st century labor market. But in the meantime, there are some important roles to be played for that institution. And we've seen SEIU, actually the communication workers are actually very good at expanding the skill set of their workers. So I think some of these unions have done a good job of finding a new niche and a new role to play in the 21st century labor market.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Holzer. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Senator Casey.
Mr. Chairman, thanks very much. I appreciate the testimony today and appreciate the work that goes into your appearance today and what you told us already in the testimony. I want to tell the chairman that as we get an opportunity, once in a while to brag about our states, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in many ways has really been at the forefront of robotics, automation for years, literally now not just years but decades. And they're into a brand new chapter. In fact, there's a community or a neighborhood in Pittsburgh they used to still call it the Strip District, but now is known also by the phrase Robotics Row. And just looking at some of the companies there now, Near Earth Autonomy is one. Real Earth is another company that performs the world's most accurate indoor 3D mapping, for example. The Near Earth Autonomy operation develops has an aerial robotic platform to analyze crop data that will help accelerate plant breeding. So on with brand new technology, and that's some of the new breakthroughs that we're seeing in a community like Pittsburgh, which had to recover over the last several decades from the collapse of steel and the larger manufacturing economy going in the wrong direction. Now they've figured out a way to invent a new future. But I was struck, did I pronounce that right? McAfee? McAfee, Dr. McAfee, when your charts tracking what's happened, the combination of what's happened to workers and productivity at the same time. One chart that I remember from going back about 2 years ago now was the original, at least what I remember is the original version, tracking productivity and wages. Similar numbers where World War II to 73, productivity was up 97, wages were up 91. 73 forward, productivity still went up over, I think it was 72%. Wages only went up 9. So no matter what chart you use or how you track it, there's been a disconnect between wages and productivity. So with that as just kind of a basic foundation for my one and only question, I start with Dr. Holzer and anyone else who wants to weigh in. With these advancements in technology and also with the knowledge we have about what has happened to wages over time, even when productivity was up, wages have been basically flat. How do we ensure that workers get their fair share of the benefits of these technological breakthroughs, the type of breakthroughs we see with automation and robotics and otherwise?
I think, first of all, that disconnect in the chart between productivity and earnings is a complicated one. So, for instance, the rise of healthcare costs certainly accounts for part of that, because that eats up part of. So if you have average compensation rather than average wages, it's not as much of a disconnect. If you use mean versus median, right, too much earnings have gone to the top 1%, sometimes because they're superstars and they deserve it, sometimes because we have terrible market failures in our financial sector. So there's all kinds of things going on. The best thing we can do is to educate our young people in skills that complement the new technologies, in skills that are not made obsolete. So playing in a symphony is not going to be outsourced or replaced by a robot. but frankly, doing good child care and good elder care also is not. Those tend to be low-wage occupations, sometimes lower than they really should be. But there's a range of skills, and some technical and some creative, in all of those kinds of occupations and skills. We want to do a better job of educating our young people. And then on top of the reforms in the system to try to deal with some of those terrible market failures that have caused too much of our income to go to the top. So I think it's that mix. But the best bet remains skills that are adaptable over people's life span, that specific to the current job and career, but still where they have some flexibility to retool. So it's a mix of general and specific. And again, looking towards the things that complement technology that will not be easily replaceable. And actually in Pittsburgh, the eds-meds interaction has been dramatically important. And again, those are the education sector and the health sector. Some diagnostics can be done through technology, many cannot. Many of the elder care for patients. And so that's an interesting example of ways in which technology will not wipe out everything we care about.
I know I'm out of time. Mr. Keiper, Dr. McAfee, if you want to answer in writing or whatever the chairman would prefer.
No, go ahead, Dan. Go ahead and answer.
Very quickly, Senator Casey, I think my colleague's answer is excellent. Education and reskilling is obviously crucial. The only thing that I would add is I'm a huge fan of an expansion of the earned income tax credit, whereas if we have people who are trying to do the right thing and get out there in the workforce and work at a relatively low-wage job like child care, like elder care, let's top their wage up with a subsidy. I actually prefer that to a substantial increase in the minimum wage because that might have a disincentive effect on the employers from employing that person. I would like to see our system work so that we directly incentivize both the employer to employ that person and that person to get out there and do that job via topping up their wages.
Okay. Mr. Keiper, either now or in writing, whatever's better.
I think those were excellent answers. I guess I would only add, if you look further out into the future, some of the theorists who think about these things worry about the possibility of a shift in the balance between labor and capital. And I think that's come up, we've kind of alluded to it a few times here today, which is to say we can imagine a future where the people who are the first investors in and owners of some of these more advanced automated technologies are going to reap much more of the profit, bring much more value than workers because there's going to be less need for certain kinds of work. That's a possibility. It's very complicated, and there's good reason to think that if that does happen, it won't last because many of these technologies may be democratized. They may become more affordable for more people. It's hard to say, though.
Thank you very much.
But it might be an argument for profit sharing as another route to go and another mechanism for government to maybe subsidize transition.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Thank you for hosting today's hearing. And gentlemen, thank you for your testimony. Manufacturing is an important industry in the state of North Carolina that I represent, and it's impacted by automation. And while automation may increase productivity and improvements can displace manufacturing workers, manufacturing output has partially grown since the recession, but we still have a ways to go in recovering jobs that were lost, which has been to some extent exacerbated by automation. But I think part of helping employment in the manufacturing industry rebound is understanding that automation and the skilled workforce can coexist. So as a matter of fact, I think it's critical that they do coexist in today's global economy. Dr. Holzer, we've seen growth in the manufacturing sector in terms of output over the last several decades, with the exception of contractions within the industry that took place during the recession. In contrast, employment in the manufacturing sector has declined, partially attributable to the growth of automation. So what role do you think automation played in the previous decline in U.S. manufacturing employment in the early 2000s, and how can we ensure that job growth and automation are working in tandem as our markets continue to evolve technologically? That's for Dr. Holzer.
There's different kinds of manufacturing, right? There's high-end advanced manufacturing, which we focused on a lot today. And then there's the apparel sector and some of the non-durable, which are less technologically advanced, but in fact, those are relatively low-wage jobs, although important to a state like North Carolina in many cases. So I think imports from China in the early 2000s devastated non-durable manufacturing. That had nothing to do with the business cycle, just a massive growth of China producing reasonably high-quality products for very low wages, and our non-durable sector simply couldn't compete with that. And that's going to happen sometimes. You know, non-durable manufacturing is just not a sector where I think Americans can concentrate. And again, they are increasingly becoming lower-wage jobs anyway. In durable manufacturing, it's a very different story. China has not played nearly as much of a role in durable and advanced manufacturing. And some companies that had actually gone to China sometimes have insourced back into America because and in fact, that's why so many German companies, and I know North Carolina, hundreds of manufacturers from Germany have entered North Carolina because the advantages of low taxes, relatively low regulation, proximity to consumers, all make the United States competitive in a lot of advanced manufacturing industries. There, the big problem is the skills. And do enough American workers. In North Carolina, as you know, when Siemens built their gas turbine engine plant, I think about 5 or 6 years ago, they refused to build the plant until they had worked out the skills problem with some of the UNC, with Piedmont Community College and UNC, which indicates that the skills problem is crucial for the innovation to continue, and it's also crucial for the workers to share in the benefits of that. So it goes back to the issue of how do we make sure that our young people have those technical skills to be able to be complements with that machinery. It has to start early in the K through 12 system. I think high-quality career and technical education can be a very important part of this. Not old-fashioned voc ed that tracked minority kids away from college. High-quality career education, exposing young people to technical skills and employability skills much earlier. I think that's the kind of thing we need to make sure that those jobs can be widely shared and the benefits distributed widely. And for folks who can't do that, the earned income tax credit is extremely important, as is wage insurance, as are very moderate increases in the minimum wage.
Okay, that was going to be my follow-up question to you. You've answered it, but let me ask about tax credits and how important you think they are in terms of also workforce training incentives and increasing productivity and innovation. How are these things going to be important, do you think?
You mean tax credits, for instance, for employers?
Yes.
Who, we don't have strong evidence on that right now. I think South Carolina is a state which is paying employers a $1,000 tax credit for every new apprentice they take on. I don't know if that's going to work or not. It's an interesting model, and what we need here is a lot of experimentation and a lot of evaluation to see what the impacts are. So tax credits could play an important role to try to help and incentivize. You know, there's a lot of employers that do very well in what we call the low road system. A combination of tax credits and technical assistance might convince more of them to upgrade their skill content in their automation.
Thank you, sir. I'm out of time. Mr. Chair, you're back.
I'm going to turn to Congressman Beyer again. He would like to start a second round, and then, given a schedule issue I have, I'm turning over the gavel made by the students at the Washington Science Tech's charter school to my colleague, Senator Lee, and I know he has some other questions he would like to ask, so I'm happy to turn that over to him. He was instrumental in helping put all this together, so I hand you the 3D design gavel and manufactured gavel. As well, if that doesn't work, here's the old faithful wood carved gavel. And you got the chair. Do whatever you want to do. Such power we're handing over to you. Mr. Beyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Your Excellency. I just had two questions. Dr. McAfee, there's a lot of discussion today about the slow rate of increase in labor productivity. And you did mention earlier that that is controversial, all the measurement techniques. And I just look at my life and the lives of the people around me and email, how much we get done per day. I mean, I think we communicate 5 or 10 times as much as I did 20 years ago. Twitter, And the fact that we know what happened in the news 30 seconds ago, as long as we stay on top of it. Telework, which is exploding, at least through the metropolitan Washington area. This is a terrible thing to say as an employer, but people always work harder at home. It's the 24/7. They're on Saturdays and Sunday nights, and or medicine. The fact that you can get blood test in 20 minutes or 15 minutes, or an X-ray a minute later, or my brother just got a new hip and went home that afternoon, and or even Amazon. We order the book in the morning and it shows up that afternoon, courtesy of U.S. Postal Service. How do we make, as an economist, how do you think about we make real progress in measuring what the difference in productivity actually is?
That's an extremely tough question, sir, because as you're pointing out, you gave some wonderful examples. None of them show up in the productivity statistics.
Exactly.
They are invisible, but they are clearly increasing our welfare. As you point out, they're increasing our health, which might be the most important thing of all. They're increasing the convenience that we enjoy in our lives, and they're not visible in our classic economic statistics. These are some of the reasons why I'm actually not that bothered about the labor productivity slowdown as we're measuring it, because that was never intended to be a welfare measure. It's not a measure of how well we're doing as an individual or as a society overall. Some of my colleagues are trying to work on correcting those measurement errors or coming up with more comprehensive ways to think about the betterment that technology brings to us. So stay tuned for those. I just want to repeat a point that I made earlier, though, which is even with all those problems, I'm pretty confident that over the next 5 to 10 years, labor productivity, even as poorly as we're measuring it, is going to go up a great deal, because the technologies that I've seen over the past couple of years, I believe are going to diffuse pretty rapidly throughout the economy and improve some of these industries like healthcare.
I find just the cloud itself. Our little family business, we're going to save $1 million this year by moving from processors in-house to the clouds.
And that's a really good example, because the cloud is actually shrinking GDP. The cloud is actually shrinking some software companies' revenues. As a result, the way we're measuring GDP, and therefore the way we're measuring productivity, will show a decrease. Now, is the cloud making your business and lots of other ones better off? Absolutely it is. It's been a huge, huge advance.
Yeah, Dr. Holzer.
I have a slightly different take on this, and I have disagreed with my two colleagues remarkably little all afternoon, which has been very nice. This bias that GDP mismeasures, it doesn't measure quality changes, for instance. That bias has always been there. It's not clear that the bias is getting worse, and there was actually recently a paper from the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank trying to measure that shows, if anything, that bias has not gotten worse and does not account for the productivity slowdown. So I'm a little less sanguine about that, and I don't think people's earnings, and I think there's a lot of reasons why, separate from the bias issue, why productivity might not be rising. There's an economist at Princeton named William Baumol. He was the inventor of an analysis called Baumol's disease. That's where he said in some parts of the service sector, in doing a symphony, you can't raise productivity. It doesn't matter how great the robots are, and he sees those sectors expanding, that there's certain kinds of chores that productivity just isn't going to grow, and they've been an expanding part of the economy. That's a problem to the extent that without that productivity growth, wages are going to stagnate as well. The other possibility is that I am troubled by the gap between profitability and productivity. It's a conundrum. We have very high profitability in the U.S. economy right now, and that's fine. I'm not against profits. But while productivity is stagnant, that's a puzzling contrast. And one of the arguments is that companies have found a lot of ways to make money using very few workers, outsourcing, offshoring, turning their workers into independent contractors where they're responsible. There's a lot of that where the incentives are not necessarily to improve productivity and output. It's to minimize labor costs at any price. So I'm a little more troubled by the product. And maybe it'll turn around. Maybe it'll be just like the 90s. Maybe we're at the cusp of another solo moment when the productivity is going to take off. But I just think there's, separate from the measurement bias, I think there's other incentive problems holding back productivity growth and therefore earnings growth.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, might I beg one last question?
Sure.
Mr. Keiper, Elon Musk, Stephen Hawking, and others have warned us about emergent properties, consciousness coming out of all the AI stuff. Do you have any concern about that? Any worries for us as policymakers? Think Terminator.
These are interesting questions, radical possibilities, and at the moment, they don't rise to the level of anything that anyone on this committee ought to be concerned about. They are things, however, that folks in technology fields, futurists, academics, should and are thinking about. And I think I'd just, for that subject, I'd just leave it at that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Could I add one word to that? Because I get asked this question all the time, and I ask this of the artificial intelligence researchers who I get to interact with. And I heard a great response from one of them. He said, worrying about this singularity or this summoning the demon because of artificial intelligence is like worrying about overpopulation on Mars.
Well, we're working on that too.
I worry about that a lot. But after reading the book, The Martian, and then seeing the movie, less concerned than I used to be. I want to thank all of you for being here today. This has been a very informative hearing. As the hearing is evidence, we live in an era of rapid and dramatically transformative technological change. Within the past 20 years, the Internet has catalyzed a global social and economic revolution, one that has affected almost everyone all over the world. We've gone from bag phones in our cars, phones that are big, to phones that fit in a bag, phones that are the size of a cinder block, to phones that are tiny in just a few years. And now we have not only phones, but supercomputers in our pockets. The incredible science that is being used to make self-driving cars a reality, and robots that can walk on two legs while maintaining balance and lift heavy objects, is also creating pretty massive and largely understandable fear of the unknown. As former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld once famously said, there are known knowns, known unknowns, and there are also unknown unknowns. He had quite a way with words, still does. It is those unknown unknowns that cause serious uncertainty and sometimes lead to fears about the future. That's why we held this hearing today, was to explore those unknowns, particularly the unknown unknowns. The value of this technology to the world economy and to our domestic economy is, of course, enormous. The impact of this technology will go far beyond the bottom lines of businesses, though. It is, and it will continue, to have an impact on the nature of work and, by extension, the ways in which we live and define our lives. But it will also impact our society more broadly and our social safety net as some individuals see their jobs becoming automated, even and especially those who don't ever see their jobs as the type that could become automated. If you ask most people if they are likely to be replaced by robots, most people are probably going to say no. A much higher percentage of them are actually likely to see their jobs replaced, perhaps within their lifetimes. The American economy has been utterly transformed in the decades since we first created most of what we think of as our first safety net. That's not just welfare programs, but also our education system and our healthcare system. In that time, Washington has not kept up. And now, as these disruptions are accelerating, policy is following much further behind, and the American people are paying a price for Washington's systemic and chronic policy paralysis. The nature of work is changing, but the nature of human beings is not. Work, vocation, service, providing, is at the nature and is at the core of human happiness. It's a source of meaning and dignity and community, and that goes for all of us, not just for people with college degrees and with skills that put us in an elite category. The American people have been resilient, and they've been more than patient, but they're competing in a 21st century economy while relying on a fraying 20th century safety net. None of us has all the answers, and I think that's the point. We need a safety net policy or a set of policies that are as flexible and nimble and diverse and as adaptable to technological change as our society and economy are becoming. And this is something that's going to need the insights of both parties to get it right. And not just both parties, but also the insights of the brightest minds in our country. And for that reason, we've been very grateful to have you here to provide that. As we've discussed today, we cannot ignore the broader impact automation will have on our society and the policy changes that Congress should be considering as the nature of work continues to change, as it has been for centuries, but as it appears to be doing on an accelerated basis. Again, thank you for coming. Thank you for your participation and your insight today. And in closing out the hearing, I'd be remiss if I didn't remind everyone that the gavel I'm using to close out the hearing, this blue gavel, was made by the good students at Washington Math and Science Tech Public High School. Thank you very much. We will stand adjourned.